How is the Book of Mormon actually translated? For millions of people, the story they know is all about an angel, golden plates, and a pair of divine spectacles. But when you dig into the historical record, the eyewitnesses tell a very different story, one that involves a stone in a hat. So today, we're going to unpack how the official narrative of one of America's most unique scriptures has changed over time, and what that tells us about the intersection of faith and history.
This quote from the incredible historian Richard Bushman, man, it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. He says the dominant narrative can't be sustained. So, what is that story? And what's this new information he's talking about? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together. All right, so first things first. Let's talk about that dominant narrative. This is the traditional story of the translation, the one that's been shown in church artwork and taught in Sunday schools for generations.
Okay, so the story you've probably seen in paintings goes something like this. The angel Moroni leads a young Joseph Smith to these buried golden plates. And with the plates, he finds this divine tool called the Urim and Thummim. They're usually described as a pair of ancient spectacles. The process seems pretty straightforward, right? Joseph looks through the spectacles at the characters on the plates, and then he dictates the English translation to a scribe. It's a simple, direct, and miraculous account.
But you know, history is, well, it's almost never that clean and simple. When we actually turn to the accounts of the people who were in the room watching this happen day after day, his scribes, his family, a very different picture starts to emerge.
And this is the pivotal question, right? If the traditional story shows Joseph carefully studying the plates with these spectacles, what do the people who were writing down the words actually report seeing?
And this is where things get really interesting. This is a direct quote from David Whitmer, one of the key eyewitnesses to the whole process. He describes something totally different, no spectacles. He says Joseph Smith would place a single stone into a hat, put his face into the hat to block out all the light, and then dictate the words. This is what's known as the stone in the hat method.
And it wasn't just him saying this. Others backed it up, including Joseph's wife, Emma. She was a scribe for a while, and she said that the plates often just sat on the table, covered with a cloth, while Joseph had his face buried in the hat. Some accounts even say the plates weren't in the room at all. So according to those who were there, he wasn't physically looking at the plates to translate them.
So what we're really talking about here are two different translation tools. On one side, you've got the Nephite interpreters, the Urim and Thummim, that reportedly came with the plates. But then you have this other thing, a personal seer stone. It was a small, brownish, oval-shaped rock that Joseph had found years before in a well. And according to one of his scribes, Joseph actually switched to using his personal seer stone for most of the translation simply because it was more convenient.
Okay, so a seer stone. Where on earth did that come from? And why was it Joseph's go-to tool? Well, to get that, you really have to understand the world he grew up in. Rural New England in the early 1800s was a fascinating place. So let's just walk through this timeline for a second. Around 1822, he finds his seer stone while helping a neighbor dig a well. Then in 1826, he's actually taken to court and charged with being a glass looker. That was the term for someone who used a stone to find lost things, like treasure. Notice also that Moroni's first visit is on the autumnal equinox, which was a pretty significant date in some of the folk traditions of the area. And all of this happens before he gets the golden plates in 1827.
Now, it's easy for us to hear folk magic and think, whoa, that's weird. But you have to remember, back then, this was kind of normal. This idea of a magical worldview was common, using things like divining rods to find water or seer stones to find lost treasure. For a lot of people in Joseph's community, this wasn't sinister. It was just a part of life.
So this is where you get this huge debate that's been going on forever. You have this mix of intense religious belief and these common folk practices. How do you interpret all of this? Is this a story about magic, a story about miracles, or maybe something in between?
And that is the central tension, isn't it? Was Joseph's use of a seer stone just an extension of his treasure-seeking days, an occult practice? Or was it a divine instrument that God used to perform a miracle? This is the question that historians, critics, and believers have been wrestling with for almost 200 years.
So if you're looking at this from a purely critical historical angle, you see a lot of connections to folk magic. Historians point out that the Smith family owned things like magic parchments and a ceremonial dagger. They note that the method, the stone in the hat, was the exact same method Joseph used when he was looking for treasure. And they highlight details like that autumnal equinox date as lining up with occult traditions.
But then you have the faith-based response, which looks at the exact same facts and comes to a totally different conclusion. The church's official position today is that Joseph learned to use this gift for a higher purpose. Apologists or defenders of the faith argue that some of the more sensational claims, like him having a Jupiter talisman, are based on pretty weak evidence. They also point out that the autumnal equinox lines up with the Jewish holy day of Rosh Hashanah, giving it a religious meaning. The big idea here is that God simply met Joseph where he was, using tools and ideas that were familiar to him to prepare him to be a prophet.
So, if all this was known back then, how did it get so lost? Why is the stone in the hat story such a surprise to so many people today? Well, for most of the 20th century, this part of the history was basically unknown to the average church member and was often flat out denied as an anti-Mormon lie.
I mean, check this out. This isn't from the 1800s. This is from the year 2000. A very prominent church leader, an apostle named Bruce R. McConkie, called David Whitmer's eyewitness account simply fiction. He said it was created just to tear Joseph Smith down. That's how strongly the stone in the hat story was rejected.
Okay, now hold that thought and fast forward just 15 years to 2015. This is from an official church magazine, and look at the difference. The church is now openly describing the very same chocolate-colored stone with an oval shape and confirming that they have it in their possession. The story that was called fiction is now being presented as confirmed history.
And this really marks a huge shift toward historical transparency. Today, the church openly discusses the Seer stone on its own website in a series of essays. They acknowledge these historical accounts that were once either ignored or denied. They even own the very stone that Joseph Smith used.
And that brings us right back to where we started with that quote from Richard Bushman. The dominant narrative is officially being updated to absorb this new information. It leaves all of us with a really powerful question. What happens when any group, a faith, a country, even a family, is faced with a history that is way more complicated and human than the story it has always told itself? It's a question about how we make peace between story and history, and about how our most important narratives change over time.